Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us to talk about carbon offsetting. So I think we're going to assume a level of understanding amongst everyone and kind of just get straight into it because we only have about half an hour. We'll save a bit of time for questions at the end. So we decided last week on the panel we have a good, a bad and an ugly. You guys can decide who's who by the end of it, but we're going to kick off with Antony. So Antony's been working in the carbon space for quite a few years. He set up a couple of startups in it. He could tell you a bit more about the company he's working for now. But I thought, Antony, you could kick off and tell us what is the ugly with carbon offsetting today?
The ugly, okay. As you mentioned, I've been trying to quantify carbon on farm through supply chains for a few years. And elementally, it's a primary data issue, and there's a lack of it, trying to really get accurate on it, and it's getting better and better. But one thing we kind of kept seeing was there was interest in the supply chain for just wanting to know if there's, where is the low carbon emission in there? Where is the low carbon commodity? Where is the low carbon products? And where we're seeing SBTI going is, and certainly brands are saying this, is that if farmers or growers, I'm talking about ag here, food and ag, this isn't applicable to outside of that. If an offset has been sold, then that product could potentially be unbuyable by the procurement process. And I'm talking now, I'm working for a company called Wiliot now, who are working with some of the largest retailers in the world, and they are saying they want to know where the regen farmers are. They want to know where the regen products are. Where could carbon credits be made on farm? And they want to buy those because the quality metric is changing. So I'd say it's ugly in the fact I would advocate carbon credits shouldn't be created in the food and ag system and shouldn't be sold. So I'm advocating don't sell it. Yeah. Keep it in the supply chain because the buyers want to buy those credits in the supply chain.
Right, so we're talking about the difference between carbon offsetting and insetting. Offsetting is where people outside of the industry purchase that to go towards their net zero targets and so on, whereas insetting is where it's kept within the supply chain. But another part of the ugly is also the potentially around the measurement and the quantifying carbon. Robert, what's your view on that? There's obviously been some scandal recently in the forestry space with the Vera issues and the discoveries there. What do you think? Where is measurement for soil carbon at the moment?
I will add to that. I think I would like to add one thought. So what's commonly also associated as the ugly is, of course, that not all companies follow the principle of reducing first and compensating later. So if you use offsetting basically as a getaway from actually reducing the emissions in your scope 1 and 2, then it's clearly not what it was intended for. And one of the correctives that can prevent it is, of course, the prices, which are increasing. As soon as the prices for offsets are increasing, there's a disincentive to do that. On the topic of measurability, Antony said it already, it's getting better, and we're clearly here on a trajectory where the measurement mistakes are getting less. But we are still far from anywhere where we could say we are at a 99% accuracy of measuring, for example, soil carbon. But what I would argue is that we don't actually need to have that accuracy because all we need is to drive change in agriculture and get as many farmers to transition as possible, because we have a time-critical issue here. If we do not get agricultural sector to change dramatically very quickly, then we won't achieve our climate targets. And so we need to accept a certain level of pragmatism. That means that we should be aware of the measurement errors we incur, calculate it in, and then move with that knowledge ahead.
I mean, I think that's fair enough, but it is still very much the Wild West, I think, in many terms in ag and food. And if people aren't trusting that a credit is giving them what they think it is, then the whole market could potentially fall apart. Jerome, coming from where you are with GoodCarbon, so GoodCarbon is a marketplace that matchmakes buyers and sellers of carbon credits in forestry mostly, but also in agriculture as well. Is that right?
Yeah, so we offer basically a marketplace where on the supply side we offer carbon credits from the three big ecosystems, which is forest, which is soil, and which is ocean. And we agreed last week that I would take the good part and I guess my statement for the beginning would be the voluntary carbon market, and it's not for the reason that I'm in this business, but I think it's a fantastic way to rebuild nature. Yeah, and I would like to really keep that message. I guess all the criticisms which we see at the moment are, I would say, the normal hiccups which you have in unregulated markets in the first couple of years. And like Robert said, I think we have troubles on the buy side, companies which are greenwashing, which are not reducing first, but basically removing or basically buying themselves free, which needs to be tackled, which can be tackled through, I guess, SBTi. And we have problems on the supply side. And I guess on the supply side, we have the problem about, let's say, standards which are not differentiating sufficiently between good and bad. Right, and I think there are. I mean, you guys are doing this fantastically for the soil on the soil front, but I guess in forest it's equally true. Removing carbon by rebuilding monoculture eucalyptus plantages somewhere in Uruguay, where eventually the timber is taken out again, is not helping the climate. Yeah? So I guess looking in detail at the quality of projects matters. Why I'm with Robert, and then I close, is I think the detailed measurement of whether you have now captured X amount of carbon or Y, I guess if you have a certain confidence interval, it's fine, because the focus should be much more on the co-benefits of those projects, biodiversity, water, nutrition pollution, and so on and so forth, and not only on carbon. And today we are only looking at carbon, but it's good that now biodiversity comes much more into the public debate of those projects as well.
Yeah, I'd like to come back to that in a second, but on the sort of demand side, in reaction to what happened with the Vera findings, have you noticed there's been an impact there?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess companies have basically put, I mean, they have revisited, and I think the criticism is right. Yeah, and I'm almost glad that the Guardian and the Zeit pulled it off, because this was more focused on the supply side, but the companies are basically now focusing on quality. So they want to invest into projects which last a long time and which really have a true impact. And I guess that was the right push to bring into the market, but it also put a couple of decisions on hold. We have experienced.
So thinking about some of these verification bodies, Antony, you and I were talking about this yesterday, and how you have private companies that are verifying credits and verifying the measurements and so on. Do you think we need to actually have that be more of a governmental role, or a role outside of the private sector?
Because of a lot of the technology in companies like Klim and GoodCarbon, you can get hold of the data now and surface it. We don't need to pay for someone, like a consultant, to come in and effectively clipboard it and get hold of the data. The data is there to be surfaced, and we can surface it to an AI in theory and have multiple AIs checking it. So I think there is actually a startup here. I'm going to make a call out to them. There's a startup here called Open Forest Protocol, and they've got quite a different way of looking at this, where they create a consensus on the verification. So it's multiple people or multiple entities looking at the same data, and then it's the consensus of getting it right. Then you earn the money. It's not about I'm going to approve it, I'm going to approve it. So I think there's an evolution business model there, which is quite exciting. And we've seen it kind of work in blockchain and that kind of methodology. And I think that's where we're going to go to. You can literally just surface the data, and you can have, in theory, thousands of people verifying it. So I think it can be private, and you can use democratic way of validating.
Do you want to tell us a bit about Wiliot? Because that's another way of measuring carbon through the supply chain.
Just very, very quickly. So Wiliot is an ambient IoT company. They've basically made computers the size of postage stamps, and it has no battery, and you can attach it to any product, these pallets, and you can make it intelligent, and you can basically start connecting it to the cloud. So now you can see things moving through supply chain real time. And then what they're exploring is, could this be a data feed for verification? Here's the feed, auto-validate, it was there. You haven't needed a human or a stamp or a brand. The data's there, consumers can do it. So again, it's a primary data issue, where things are, when they're there, and what conditions they're experiencing.
So coming back to this idea of carbon tunnel vision, which some of you might have heard about, is carbon even the right metric and the right thing to be selling credits off and measuring and so on? What do you think, Robert?
So I think there's a reason we started with carbon. Compared to many other externalities, it's comparably easy to measure, even though we are currently talking about how hard it is to measure. So it makes total sense historically. But what's referred to as carbon tunnel vision means that we reduce everything just to the carbon aspect, and that, at least for example, regenerative agriculture, is far too short-sighted. The beauty about regenerative agriculture is that you actually generate benefits in a multitude of areas. So you improve on biodiversity, you improve on food security, because you improve the water absorption and capacity to store it for soils, which means that you have less crop loss. You improve also the livelihoods of the farmers, and in the mid to long term, you can improve the nutrition availability in the soils and therefore the quality of the foods. And so that means that you're actually, you're able to contribute to a broad range of externalities that needs to be reflected. And it's just one of the examples where if you would just look at, oh, we have challenges to measure carbon accurately, you would just basically cut far short of what's actually important and the reality there.
And can you tell us a bit about how Klim, you're working with companies and farmers to transition?
Yeah, so for Klim, the mission is to scale up the adoption of regenerative agricultural practices amongst farmers as quickly as possible. And in order to achieve that goal, we have chosen a systemic approach where we, on the one hand, work with farmers. We enable them to transition via a digital platform and an app where they can access know-how, can exchange ideas with other farmers, can quantify their progress, can make a plan how they should start, because regenerative agriculture is complex and risky if you've never done it before. And then they can get quantified what they do and can get paid for it. And now the big question is, of course, who finances that? In our case, we are predominantly working with the food industry in so-called insetting projects, which would more accurately be called supply chain transformation. So if you will, maybe 10, 15 years ago, everyone was talking about the digital transformation. Now in food, it's about the regenerative transformation. And these food companies oftentimes don't have access to their own farmers. Even if they did, they wouldn't know how to convert them. And even if they could do that, they couldn't verify them independently. And we offer them all that as a service in a scalable way. And most importantly, which is why they work with us, we do that in a way where the farmer trusts us. We're working very farmer-centric. So that's what we do.
Okay. So the three of you could actually all work together, is that right? So you could be generating the data from your sensors, you're helping the farmers transition, and then you can be selling the credits on the other side.
Yeah, so we are. So Klim credits are soon available on GoodCarbon. I just wanted to add one comment towards the insetting topic. And I guess in agriculture, it's pretty easy to understand, right? Because nature and regenerative, although agriculture and agriculture is the same, right? But I guess the insight is that 50% of the GDP is dependent directly or indirectly on the productivity of nature, right? And that is also true for industries which are not, although which are less obviously dependent on it. Yeah? Say, take caoutchouc in automotive, take retail sales, take consumer packaged goods, take construction. Yeah? So all sorts of industries which are basically relying with their productivity on the productivity of nature. And I guess the big trend which we see on the demand side at the moment is to match really the environmental footprint of companies, not only the carbon footprint, which is easy, but the environmental footprint of companies, that's what Robert alluded to, with then the project environmental footprint. And that can be not only in soil, but it can also be in forests and can be in ocean. Yeah? So if you are basically a shipping company and you essentially use the oceans for obviously for shipping, you want to rather give back in the oceans than maybe in agriculture. Yeah? Or if you historically companies have been offsetting, in water power plants in China, completely unrelated to their value chain. Yeah? So I think this movement of insetting first, and if insetting doesn't work because there is a limit to it, then to move into really a value chain aligned compensation where you can also basically relate as a business to it, and where you can also take your suppliers onto the journey. So that's what I would call the wave 2 in compensation, moving away from stupid offsetting to intelligent data-driven offsetting.
Just going back to your point about carbon tunnel vision, we just had what was it called? The biodiversity COP, which I think was quite significant. Now, you don't get carbon sequestration without biodiversity, generally. I'm not a scientist, but that's what I understand. I've been told by experts, and I've seen it kind of happen. So I think that's, I think that is actually the opportunity maybe for food, is food can be traced back to a piece of land. And you can basically pinpoint to, I'm destroying nature or I'm improving nature, a food brand can. And I think that's going to have more teeth than carbon. And what I mean by that is, like, if I'm in a company that's emitting carbon, you can't really blame me for pumping CO2 into the air and it impacted a Peruvian farmer in South America. But I can blame you, company, with traceability and biodiversity monitoring, I can blame you for what you've destroyed on nature. And it is, as people are pointing out, it is contributing to 50% of GDP. It contributes, essentially. So that is declining rapidly. So I think we are going to move quite soon to this biodiversity credit or mapping.
But can I just maybe build on this, what you said earlier, yeah? So there can't be any any carbon capture without biodiversity. I'm not a scientist as well, yeah? But the only thing I know is that monoculture forest in eucalyptus is the fastest growing tree you can have, yeah? Where you can then also take the timber for it for your production, and the biodiversity impact is zero, yeah? Because it's just it's a number of trees, but it's not a functioning ecosystem. Yeah? And I think that's one of the problems which you have today, at least in the space of forest, that on the supply side, you have companies still investing into projects which claim to be permanent, which claim to be additional, but which have almost destroying effects on biodiversity, because the ground afterwards, after having an eucalyptus forest there, you can't use it anymore for many years. So I think this quality aspect and biodiversity needs to be looked at jointly when evaluating projects.
I'd like to add a thought. What I find really interesting about this whole discussion of how to quantify co-benefits and region ag, that actually the industry we're working in almost acts like a test bed for a sustainable form of capitalism. Because if you look at it, we need to find ways to quantify negative externalities we create in any industry. Negative externalities can be created in all kind of dimensions, whether it's social, for example, what do social networks create in terms of negative externalities when we talk about young children being subjected to certain images? Or what kind of negative externalities do you create if you build houses that aren't really beautiful and destroy the architectural image of a city? There's negative externalities in thousands of dimensions that we could look at. And so far, we've only ever looked at carbon. But with Regen Ag, it's one of the first sectors we are trying to think beyond carbon. And we are running into lots of challenges that are related to that. And in addressing these challenges, I see an opportunity to perhaps create the blueprint for a broader framework that we could use in society. And if we would at some point arrive at a situation where any industry quantifies the negative externalities they create in the social dimension, in the ecological dimension, in the economical dimension, and we can find smart compensation mechanisms for it, then I think we'll be a big step towards a sustainable form of doing economic growth.
Maybe just to add, I think politics has recognized that problem gladly, and I think the European taxonomy and also the requirements which 50,000 companies will have starting next year when they have to report in the CSRD clearly goes beyond just carbon. It goes towards biodiversity, it goes towards climate change adaptation. And I think that is a huge challenge for companies today, that they all of a sudden have to understand all the negative externalities which they have in their business, which is huge. I mean, it's like Latin for people who haven't learned Latin. Yeah. So, and I think the good thing is regulation has recognized it, and companies have to move in that direction. because they have to become transparent. And that will give us huge push, I think, also on the quality aspect of projects, that they are asking for projects which have co-benefits, not only on biodiversity, but also on social and benefit sharing with local communities.
Sorry, can you tell me more about what was the regulation you're saying that's coming in 2 years?
It's essentially saying that companies need to disclose. It's not yet auditable. They don't have to. You don't have to get it audited, but they have to disclose the impact they have on various dimensions, which is including climate change adaptation, mitigation, biodiversity, waste, recycling, and so on and so forth. And they also have to say what impact basically those factors have on their business. So they have to understand basically the dependency which they have from those production factors, and that will give obviously then the insight, hey, I'm dependent on it, and then I also need to change something. And I think capital markets will take their investment decisions, banks will take their investment decisions when they give credit ratings on basically those reportings much more.
Is that a European regulation?
Yeah. European.
Weren't we talking about something similar in the US, but it's around food? They've framed it slightly differently, but you think it might be related to carbon as well?
Yeah, I mean, the US is, in 2 years' time, is the Food Safety Modernization Act. It's going to require, again, traceability all the way back to the field. Like, within 24 hours, a restaurant has to know for certain food types where the whole provenance was, every single node. If there's a FDA asks, they need to know, the restaurant needs to know all the way back to the field and who touched that lettuce, that milk, that fish. And it's, again, very similar. I think it's exactly the same requirement that the EU is bringing on deforestation. So the deforestation rule, I think, comes in 18 months' time. There's certain product types to get over the border into the EU. You need the provenance back to the field, which is just great news for all this regenerative agriculture efforts, for example. I think they're very similar. They're both continents and groups are basically trying to improve security of supply chain. And I think what's eventually going to happen is a rollout of a tax system. It is the new trade war, I believe. Carbon is the trade war. It is, as much as it's tunnel vision, it is the currency which America and China agree on what 1 ton of carbon is. I keep referring to that. Like, they argue on their currency what is the real number, but they definitely agree on what 1 ton of carbon is. So it's going to be used as a trade war. Like, EU is going to bring in the carbon border adjustment tax. So if you're polluting elsewhere and you want to bring it into the EU, you have to pay a tax to get it into the country, which means companies in Europe will basically start sourcing from within Europe. I've been talking to a chocolate trader who's like, they've got their hands on their heads and they're like, it's going to completely change our business model. Like, they're going to have to now source locally chocolate. That doesn't make sense. We're going to get palm oil and cocoa from locally. It's just not going to happen.
What I wanted to add is I think eventually the biggest challenge will be to disentangle the supply chain and to understand your supply chain. So scope 3 for most companies is around 80 to 90% of their emissions. And those emissions are basically, you buy them, right? So the product, when they arrive at the factory gate, they are already full of CO2 and potentially other environmental harm. And eventually companies will need to overcome the challenge. How can they also get their suppliers into the responsibility to decarbonize quickly? And I think that will be them. You are on that track already. That will be a new discipline also for companies on the purchasing side.
Yeah, on the point of disentangling supply chains, so of course a farmer who has a broad crop rotation, who produces potatoes and wheat, will deliver to several food companies. So he's in the supply chain of several food companies, and I think we will not get around some form of cross supply chain cooperation that's needed amongst the food corporates. And there's fortunately some signs there that this is actually happening. There's just no way around it. Otherwise, we wouldn't achieve the goal of this, which always has been maximum impact. And on that note again, so we talked about the bad of, for example, under measuring. I think it's important to always keep in mind the end goal, what we want to achieve here. We want to achieve maximum impact. Maximum impact means maximum regeneration of ecosystems or maximum reduction of current negative externalities. And the only way to do that is we constantly choose the optimal approach between under-measuring and allowing greenwashing and over-measuring and in the end not achieving the speed we need to create that impact. And that optimization function needs to be readjusted every year because technology advances. You can measure more accurately and customers wisen up. And I think that is what I would see as the great challenge here, to keep this discussion honest on let's focus on the target, maximum impact, and let's not fight any ideological battles.
Yeah, so probably safe to assume the next couple of years with the introduction of these regulations, the technology is going to accelerate very fast. And maybe some of these ugly things around quantification and measurement might become less of an issue.
Yeah, I think now it's in the CFO, it's in the boardroom now. Sustainability used to be this side thing. I'm talking more and more to these food companies through Wiliot, and I'm talking to the CFO. The CFO's asking for, I need the quantification now. That's a game changer. So I think we're going to see an explosion in demand for tech companies like Klim, for example.
So I'll come to any questions in a minute. So have a think what you want to ask. You need to ask something. But I have one question, which is always about it's about farmers and how are they faring with all this? Can they win from this situation? You know, I think farmers have been through a lot, and they've were asked to produce as much as possible with less, have bigger yields, use these products, and so on. Now they're being asked to transition their practices, which they've been doing for many, many years, and then sell their credits off to corporates. And how are they faring in all this? Are they definitely going to benefit too?
So right now there's multiple reasons why a farmer should adopt regenerative agricultural practices. And the demands of their, let's say, the purchaser, the food company they're working for, or regulatory pressure is only one. The other is, of course, the reality forces them to do so. If you look at the climate conditions, the last 5 years in northern Germany, for example, were droughts or drought-like conditions. Crop loss was a major problem. And if you do not adopt regenerative practices, you will be far more susceptible to crop loss. At the same time, prices for fertilizers and other input have increased. So if you want to remain profitable, regenerative agriculture is your best bet. So there's multiple reasons why farmers should actually do that, and many are already intrinsically motivated. Yet the fact remains that it's not easy, it's a risk, so you need some financial transition finance, you need access to know-how, and that's probably the largest gap that we've seen. Whenever a young graduate from an agricultural university comes work with Klim, I ask them, what excited you about Regen Ag in the first place? How did you learn about it? It was never the university. That's shocking. And so the knowledge gap is one that really needs to be addressed. How do the farmers react if you approach them? Of course, it depends, but in general, often you see farmers saying, aren't we already doing a lot? We're using cover crops, isn't that enough? But then actually, if you engage them in a conversation or you show them through, could be digital know-how in form of videos, how much is actually possible, they're often very, very open to change. But I don't want to deny it, the biggest challenge is not, in my view, just to measure what's going on, but to actually get the farmers to convert in the first place. Because otherwise you just measure the status quo. And if you do not measure any change, you have no delta, you have no credit. So that's how I would say it. And the other question is, that's really on my mind a lot. We all know that farmers have always been the ones who have been marginalized over millennia. They have been the price takers. They have been at the receiving end of pressure from the food companies. Now, suddenly there's a new business model for them, carbon credits or insetting, so they can actually perhaps even earn a little bit on top. Will that be pressured out again through other mechanisms? That's the big question we have. And what we hope is that it won't happen because consumers care more where their food comes from, and we could enable them to actually see that with better quality of the food, there's a reason to give farmers fairer prices for what they produce. And the other one is farming in a way becomes more complicated and more complex even than it already is. And so I hope that this will kind of counteract this marginalization.
I just want to add one point and maybe close from the beginning, the good about the voluntary carbon market, and maybe stress this social aspect. And we on the platform have projects not only from Germany, but also from, for example, India, and other Asian countries, where through regenerative agriculture, you bring so much education to local communities and smallholder farmers that you essentially have really a social benefit and educational benefit to those local communities, which otherwise would not happen. Yeah? So the question of why is this additional? Yeah, because the voluntary carbon market allows farmers to move into something more sustainable in areas which are normally not accessible, or where education is not easily accessible for those communities. And this aspect of social impact is often forgotten when we speak about carbon credits also, because if done correctly, they have climate impact, nature impact, and social impact. And that's, I think, hugely important to fight global inequality, which will get even worse with climate warming.
Do we have any questions at all? Great.
Hi, thank you. Is it, which carbon is better? The carbon that has been which you didn't let go into the environment, or the environment that, or the carbon that you captured from the environment? Which is premium? The preventive carbon?
I'm not quite sure whether you meant removals versus reductions. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, like what is better?
So I personally think we need all kind of sources. So I don't personally differentiate
So, but
much.
between good, bad, and ugly, like which is priced higher?
I would perhaps I don't like to categorize things in that simple ways, but
I mean, typically what we see is that removal credits, at least in forest, in regenerative agriculture, is probably more differentiated, but in forest and also in ocean are probably 60-70% more expensive than avoidance. But it also depends on the cost structure of the project, right? So if you're buying land versus not buying land, that obviously drives the price difference massively. Yeah? And that can be true for avoidance or for removal. So either you protect forests or you recreate forests. And for example, in India, we have a project where the land is provided by the government, and only the carbon credit, basically financing, goes to finance, the mangrove restoration. Yeah? So the price for the mangroves is lower for 1 ton of CO2 than if you would have to buy the entire land.
Or maybe just let me reframe it. What's the gold standard of carbon credit? Is there a categorization that exists? A, B, C, D? If there is a gold, which credit would you pay? Which carbon credit would you pay the most for?
Well, the gold standard is the gold standard. It's called the gold standard. That's one. I would say all existing standards which have a high market share are not able to differentiate good from bad. That's unfortunately true. Yeah? So we have seen bad projects, Bors and Werra. We have seen bad projects in Gold Standard, even though they're less, they have a tiny market share for nature-based solution projects only. There are new standards which are emerging, outside the ones which are sitting here, but they have tiny market shares at the moment. Yeah? So the 80% market share company Werra has, in the projects, they are also validating huge quality differences.
I think just to add, so when I looked into this before, the problem is carbon is a commodity. And when you deliver a commodity, you want to know you definitely get it. Deliver me 1 ton of wheat, deliver me 1 ton of gold. I wonder, when we talk about nature-based solutions, that's the problem. And when markets can't validate it, they discount it. So the highest quality ones are arguably the ones you can really measure. So for example, direct air capture is supposedly, I'll pay a lot for that, because I know you've definitely got 1 ton of carbon. Biochar is a good one. I think you can weigh that. And that seems to get a really good price. But But it goes back to, for nature-based solutions, it's the quantification is really just holding down. But it is, I believe, what is the most gold standard, I believe, is prevention of carbon, I believe, personally.
But that's opposite of what you said.
I know, but I am actually in the camp of we shouldn't even, like carbon shouldn't, nature-based solutions, it shouldn't be a commodity. We should pay them an asset management fee. So thinking like, you've got 200 tons of carbon you're looking after, an asset manager, I should pay you a fee. Like as VC, I get paid an asset management fee for looking after someone's money. Well, we've just said nature is the most important asset on the planet. We should start paying farmers a management fee. Klim farmers get charged to be on the land. We've got the model completely wrong. We need to flip it. We need to pay farmers an asset management fee.
I love that as an ending point. Did anyone have a follow-up question at all? Yes?
What do you think will be more popular for farmers, offsetting or insetting?
I didn't understand.
Be more profitable?
No, more popular.
So at the moment, the price they get is exactly the same, but within setting, we are engaging in much longer term contracts. And so you have probably more predictability, I would say. Whether the prices will start to diverge is something I don't know at the moment. There's some who think that a different model for insetting will hold place, where farmers are get paid in a completely different model, but it's too early to say whether we will go there. At the moment, it's the same price in terms of credit.
But also something I was going to ask about. You were talking yesterday about farmers, if they sell their carbon credits, their actual buyer might not want to purchase something from them because they want to keep that carbon within their supply chain. So then it's going to impact that farmer's ability to sell into their usual client. Is that right? Yeah, and that is a worry. That worries
Scope 3.
me. You could lose
Their
your
Scope 3 will be higher for, like, say, Walmart. If they're buying milk from the farm and they've sold the credit into the offset market, the emission number's higher.
Yeah.
So if you've got to keep it
But,
in the supply chain.
that's a follow-up from me, is how can we make sure the farmers understand what the best decision is? Should they sell an offset, or should they keep it and have it as an inset for their buyer? And they're probably going to make the wrong mistake. And again, that really worries me.
Yeah, I was very fortunate to work on a farm for a couple of years, and this is, in the end, they're working on thin margins, got zero money. Someone showed them the money. And if the offset market's offering the money, they've got to take it sometimes to keep the business alive. But I'm saying to food companies, there's not many of these farmers. If you really want to hit your targets, you better secure the best farmers and bank their credits and enter long-term contracts. Put the carbon credit into the price of the product and secure. The carbon credit is a signal on high-quality produce. We didn't get into it, but it's also a signal on high nutrition as well. It's a whole different topic. But I think that's where I'll go to as well. And that's where we take the industry from a 6 trillion industry in food to a 12 trillion industry when food starts becoming preventative healthcare. And that's as a whole, that's a whole other topic
that,
as well.
Juicy. There was another question. Does someone else have a question? I know we're going over time, but maybe you don't mind.
Well, we know there's no silver bullet and there are many problems in this market, but hopefully more people will get paid to preserve their land, period. And if you had a magic wand, what would the one thing at the top of your wish list that you would like to have to make your operations better or increase the integrity in the market?
It's a great question. What's at the top of your wish list? What's at the top of your wish list to improve your business, to improve the credibility of the carbon markets?
I guess that companies continue to leverage the voluntary carbon market to rebuild nature, right? And that they pay attention to quality and that they do not get, that they obviously follow the mitigation hierarchy, but that they continue to not to be afraid, right? And I'm not saying this for the purpose of my company, but just because we need to close a funding gap of 2 to 5 trillion US dollars to basically get the benefit to decarbonize the atmosphere and also have biodiversity impact. And that's so much money, it has to come from somewhere. And now the voluntary carbon market is a mechanism to basically, get something in return for restoring nature. It didn't exist before, so that's my wish.
I like that question a lot. I thought, should I say, I wish that regulatory bodies make regulation that's really impact focused. But in the end, I would just wish that everybody in the food industry and everybody in adjacent industries actually visits a farm of a regenerative farmer and really kisses the ground, to speak in the terms of that movie, to get excited about what agriculture actually can do and realize what you can achieve with this one sector, how many SDGs you're actually addressing, to see the magnitude of the opportunity so that we get the conviction and the courage to move ahead at a much faster speed, which is needed.
That carbon becomes the standard quality metric in food procurement. I think that would accelerate everything a lot faster. It will rechange supply chains. When you start to buy 1 ton of apples and the quality metric is not shape and size, it's what's the footprint. As soon as that's in the procurement process, it'll be a game changer because you'll be sourcing completely different, and the price will go up down the supply chain. And that's what farmers have. They have the ability to deliver a carbon negative product, or they can deliver you a carbon emission product. And they can do it through regen, for example. So that's why I'm incredibly bullish on food. I think food businesses will be the most valuable businesses by 2050. Like Apple can't be carbon negative. It will never be carbon negative, but a food company has the ability to regenerate nature. So yeah, that's why I hope we'll accelerate that happening.
Great. Well, thank you all. Sorry we went over time. Thanks very much for joining us.